People need to turn off their microphone, I think, perhaps. But anyway, that's for the people at home. So as you can see here in this room, there are a few people present, and also at home, there are a number of people present to attend this knowledge session, which is organized by the China Knowledge Network, which is a rather unique collaboration between departments and the, let's say, the experts in the everlasting quest for the right information and solid research on China. And as it happens, this session is about that topic and about the challenge of getting China right and getting the right information from China, which a challenge which is getting harder and harder. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's actually the first part of a two-part series, of which the next one will be in December, which is about how China and Europe understand each other. I'll explain the one which happens in December later on at the end of this session, but this one is therefore about the challenge of getting China right with Vincent Brussee, who will join me in a minute. Before we do, I would like to remind everybody that this is a Chatham House rule session. The Vincent presentation will be recorded, and that will take about half an hour, after which we will stop the recording and the floor is open to ask Vincent questions. And after the questions, there will be drinks for the people who are in the room. And if people want to come over from wherever they are, then more than welcome. Anyway, without further ado, I've got a clicky thing, which I'm going to use right now to introduce Vincent Brussee. There he is. Vincent, please join the people at home. You're going to have to stand here because otherwise you're invisible. Anyway, you did Asia studies, worked at the Shanghai consulate and at Merits, where you did part of this research. So that's quite good to mention that as well. And you were busy doing your PhD, which we'll talk later as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, and so you can start your presentation. And a warm
Yeah, thank you so much, Boris, and also thank you so much to the China Knowledge Network for hosting me here today. It's lovely to be talking about the challenge of getting China right, even more so because it's a little tongue-in-cheek. So as Boris said, I used to work for Merix, and their slogan was "Getting China Right." So then to speak about the challenge of getting China right, no hard feelings whatsoever towards Merix, but is hopefully going to make for an interesting day. What I'm going to talk about today, in a way, it's not going to help you immediately resolve the big questions about semiconductors. I'm not going to tell you what is going to happen to Taiwan in 5 or 10 years. But I'm going to talk about a lot of the challenges that underpin the answers to that question. So how can we get to know the answers to these kind of questions in the first place? And that sounds like a very boring meta question, or very simple question, but articles like this keep coming out every day nowadays. This is an article from just 2 weeks ago from The Economist about how the Chinese authorities are concealing the state of the economy. If you go back another week from that article, there was an article in the Volkskrant discussing about how China is increasingly becoming a data island. So how it is controlling what data can be accessed by foreigners, by even
Hello, we lost the sound. We can't hear you anymore.
okay, it should be.
Is that better?
Yes, it should be. I'll just continue to talk while we're at it. So one of the first basically challenges that we have to talk about is how information is disappearing. And yeah, sorry, I tend to use a lot of animations in my slides. Let's see. All right. So the first challenge, essentially, that when we talk about this, about kind of the changing information access in China, is how information essentially keeps disappearing. Just a few months ago, an article on Chinese social media went absolutely viral, speaking about how basically 99.999% of information from, say, like 2002 had disappeared. It was an author who tried to research essentially what was happening with Jack Ma in the early 2000s. And this person basically said, I cannot find any information whatsoever about this anymore. Now, not all of this is a political problem. It's also a problem that we have in Europe with simply websites going defunct, news outlets going defunct. But for a report that I wrote for Merrick's, we tried to look at how this is affecting government documents specifically. So we looked at a sample of about 4,000 government documents that we retrieved in 2021. And we looked at whether these were still available 2 years later, so in 2023. And what we found is that simply 22% of those documents we were already unable to access again. And that's a very short time frame, right? 2 years. So you can imagine what happens if you extend this to 5 years and to 10 years. And rest assured, we will be rerunning this analysis to find what happened then. But so the conclusion is then it makes it really difficult to study initiatives that are not just happening in the now and present, but that have spanned longer periods of time.
Are these randomly disappeared, or are there certain topics which disappeared?
Yeah, so we were not able to find any topical changes, but we found 4 main reasons. So one was that the websites were becoming inaccessible. I'll get back to that point in a separate slide. Another part was simply because the website had undergone a change and webmasters in China did not migrate the content to a new infrastructure. This is something that happens a lot. It's not uniquely Chinese, but one of the problems in the Chinese context is there is no legal framework that governs archiving of government documents. So they can just disappear whenever. And then this kind of 2%, which was a relatively small group, were documents that were censored because they were either deemed invalid, controversial, whatnot. But so these are the government's own sources, essentially, that are disappearing. But we were not able to find any topical points on that. The second point is declining transparency. So declining transparency refers to document or kind of sources that the government used to regularly publish and that is no longer publishing. It's not necessarily taking down information from the past, it's just no longer updating new sources. And one example is China's Courts Judgment Online database. For those unaware, it's a database that is run by the Supreme People's Court that aggregates court judgments from all across the region. So up until a couple of years ago, there were about 100 million court verdicts from all across China on this database. And these were really crucial to researchers to understand essentially how China's often rather vague laws and regulations are being implemented in practice, how they are enforced in practice. And what you see is the database was founded in 2012. There was a very significant increase in transparency until 2020, with more and more court verdicts being uploaded to the public, but suddenly plummeting after 2020. And so this chart goes until 2022. The picture gets worse in 2023. What is happening here is that the government essentially realized that it was too politically risky to have all of these verdicts online to the entire public. Now, instead, they're moving all this data to a private portal and only curating a very small subsection of about 4,000 edited cases to the public so that lawyers can still understand how the courts at least want the law to be interpreted. But in the process, we've lost millions, tens of millions of documents per year that used to be published. And the story basically continues when you look at, for instance, government documents, so policy documents, the kind of documents that would inform us about China's strategy, China's intention in a variety of fields. You see here the percentage of documents that the State Council releases to the public as a percentage of all the documents that it formulates annually. You see again that in 2022, there was basically the lowest percentage since 2013. Here too, you see there was kind of an increase until the mid-2015s, even under Xi Jinping, but a decrease specifically around 2019, 2018 afterwards. The last kind of question that we have to face, especially as researchers, is one of access denials. So where information is not being taken down, it's still being updated, but specifically government authorities are trying to restrict access from outside China. Some cases do more specific user groups, but in many cases, everyone who is based outside China. And here too, we looked at a sample of about 520 government websites, and we found that again, about a quarter of them was unavailable to us from a German IP address. You see here, it depends a little bit on what country or kind of what region you're accessing from. But generally speaking, kind of aggregating all of this, about a quarter of government websites is unavailable, at least from the sample that we looked at. Now, again, you see that there's a variety of reasons here. Sometimes it's just a website that crashes, and apparently in China that happens a lot. Investment in government websites is often very ad hoc, very limited. In many cases, we however found that simply the website was explicitly geo-blocking us. So basically looking at the server can see where a request is coming from by its IP address and then decides to essentially blacklist all IP addresses that are outside China. In some cases, we found simply technical bottlenecks with internet routing services in China. But no matter what you're talking about, 25% was inaccessible.
Do you anywhere in the research from the routing issues and the further crackdown on the Great Firewall and kind of content can be accessed? Is there any link in the research?
Great, good. I love the interaction. Or for the recording sake, perhaps it's better and just save your questions for after that.
Yeah, please. Can I guarantee chat mouse rules otherwise, right?
Well, yeah.
But I'm happy to return to that question if I don't answer it in the process. I mean, the technical bottlenecks were mostly related to simply limited routing capacities for cross-border traffic. And there's a great paper that calls it the Great Bottleneck of China, in contrast to the Great Firewall of China. And you can find that online. I think it's available on open access. But so these are kind of the main challenges that the field faces. I mean, I just showed geo-blocking of government websites, but there's also a lot of other kind of private data providers that are restricting access to their sources. Enterprise lookup databases like Chichacha, Tianyancha, ITCha have been some of the most high profile. We've seen academic database CNKI implement restrictions on certain types of its data for foreign license holders, including my own university. So we've lost access to some data sources from CNKI as well. Really, it's a long list, and that list is unfortunately not getting any shorter at this moment. So I hope that I've convinced you by now, at least, or perhaps you didn't need convincing in the first place, that getting China right is increasingly difficult due to many of these challenges. But I think it would also be a little bit disingenuous to simply end the story here, because I also want to talk about, I've accidentally not turned it off. There's also a story that we need to have about ourselves in this picture. And so I recently wrote a book on China's social credit system, and I'm not going to tell you all about the book, but I want to introduce it. Sorry?
You should buy it all.
You should all buy it all. Yeah, I'll have the cover on the screen in a moment. But I want to introduce it as an example of getting China wrong. And not because there's not enough information about the social credit system to go around. The social credit system is one of the most transparent initiatives in China's government history. For good or for worse, and you can still say that is by Chinese government standards, but for good or for worse, it is the most transparent one. But if you are to just Google now social credit, you would find these kind of headlines. China ranks citizens with a social credit system. Your behavior as a grade. Spend frivolously and be penalized under China's social credit system. But even kind of drawing parallels between surveillance systems in Europe or in the US, or potentially about transnational implications of the social credit system. The point is not for you to discuss all of these myths themselves, but rather it is almost impossible to think about surveillance in China, in Europe, about big tech, about AI, without in some form or another invoking the social credit system. And I've had plenty of such stories where when at Leiden University, they wanted to install cameras to check on attendance during COVID. That was compared with the social credit system on the first instance. But the point that I want to make with this is that this story has no resemblance whatsoever to any reality in China. And it got so extreme that when Chinese citizens learned essentially about the stories that were going on around the social credit system, they found it so bewildering that they created memes about these portrayals of the system that was supposed to rule their lives. So they created a mock-up of what an app for the social credit system could be. Well done. Your credit has already surpassed 76% of netizens. You see the eye observing you. You're a second-rate citizen, and your score has increased by 2 points over, and with then there's a sudden incident. Foreign spies have increased in value. You can receive extra points. Report now to receive prizes, and you can indicate saying when they committed the incident, and just you need to indicate whether you already shot them dead or whether it required investigation to get your points. The problem being, if your score drops below 0 points, you have to schedule your appointment with the firing squad. You can just click here, and it'll be arranged for you. Now, there's a lot to be said about this incident, and so I want to refer you to my book if you're interested about social credit itself. But I'm not here to give you a marketing talk. I want to reflect essentially on what this means for how we make sense of China, and essentially what the takeaways I think for this are for if we study in the future some kind of human rights related issues in China or AI related issues in China. Because the story of the social credit system is not going to go away, whether it has any basis in truth or fact or not. I think the way that this whole story came about was it started with speculation in 2014. And then that speculation started to grow a life of its own, almost in a game of Chinese whispers. So right, I whisper something to you, you whispered on to the next. And at the end, kind of the story that I didn't hear back from you doesn't resemble anything like the original thing at all. And this is what has happened with social credit. Speculation started it off. That speculation was then taken as gospel. They kept referring to the same sources, but no one actually read the sources, or they simply did not have the capacity to understand what these sources meant. So at some point, a couple kind of steps in this Chinese whispers game, what happened was that people said there were things in the source that simply were never in that source to begin with, just because they assumed that was what other people said and did not do their due diligence, as you may say, to actually check what was happening. And social credit is really far from the only problem that we've encountered with making sense of China, getting China right. Recently, this report about overseas Chinese police activities made very significant waves in the political community, but also in just the media. But here too, a colleague of mine dove into some of the claims made in the report. They were based on erroneous machine translations. So, for instance, they claimed that a local police bureau had sent 70 people directly overseas. The only thing that the source actually said is there were 70 people involved in this police bureau, but there's nothing in the source that actually says that the people of the police bureau went abroad. There was nothing that kind of backed that up. And there were more of these kind of errors. One claim said that Chinese police host need to neck conversations with suspected fugitives abroad. What did the actual need to neck phrase that they were referring to mean? It meant a close and intimate conversation appealing to reason and emotion. That's quite a different meaning, right? And so Jeremy Down, who I can highly recommend, he actually looked into why did they get this translation so wrong? And he came up with the point that the only reason or the only way they could have come up with this translation was if they used Google Translate integrating for entire websites. And not just copy pasting small bits into Google Translate, but rather when you go on a website, you have this function to enable Google Translate or to translate the entire page. Only if they use that specific step were they able to arrive at this translation. And I'm singling out this one report here because it went so viral in Europe. Some of the authors, they did rectify a number of the most significant mistakes, but you can also argue that at that point, the harm has already been done. Because by the time that is rectified, people are no longer reading the report, but they have all the impressions out there. And again, this is no incident. The most recent lab leak theory. Now I'm starting with my own animations. The recent allegations by ProPublica that would support the lab leak theory, again based on questionable translations of Chinese source materials. More recently, the national intelligence law that again sparked a lot of concerns in the community about whether or not certain institutions in China may be forced to collaborate with essentially intelligence services. Again, a translation that was cited at least 250 times in media was found, again by Jeremy Down, my good friend, to be based entirely on machine translations with sections that simply made no sense. And again, read what he wrote to kind of see how bad it was. So where I want to end on essentially is what I think is not so much the challenge of getting China right, but the toxic cocktail of getting China wrong, which consists for a very large part of Beijing kind of restricting access to reliable sources, right? First part of the presentation, this is something that may only be getting worse. One of the consequences is that doing good research, going to China and asking people, understanding what is actually happening on the ground is becoming more and more difficult. So then getting these reliable insights, it requires a lot more creativity, a lot more investment, a lot more skill, and simply a lot more money. And not everyone has those resources. And in addition, we simply see that there is a very large demand and even competition for China knowledge. So, you know, I've worked at a think tank like many people here as well. I personally experienced that there was a lot of pressure to be the first to report on something just because that's what gets you clicks. And that's what may get you your promotion. That is not, you know, it doesn't invalidate anything that's happening there, but that is simply a dynamic that I do think we have to face in the field. And I think what that is leading to essentially is that that combination together means that in many cases we are chasing shadows. We are chasing essentially misinformation that in part is created by a lack of access to Chinese sources, but also in part with how we deal with this lack of information, lack of access to reliable sources. Now, to conclude, how can we get China right again? And I think for a good solution, we have to consider both sides of the story. The first is, if China is restricting access to information, we need to develop our own systems of information. So we need to develop open source archives, archives that exist outside the People's Republic of China, that exist irrespective of the Chinese government liking these archives existing or not. In many cases, they will not. In some cases, they will not mind. That are also not gatekept by expensive service providers, because that will inevitably harm the quality of the China debate. Because what if, you know, only one organization has access to a commercial data provider and no one can fact check whether that is actually correct? I think that would inevitably harm the plurality of the China debate. So in some form or other, investing in these open source archives, I think, is crucial. The second is that we need to be really, really careful in seeing AI, open source intelligence as a full replacement for sinology. And I mean, I'm moving into data science, so I think I can say this without kind of, you know, touting my own horn, so to speak. We've seen it in mistranslations. We've seen it in contextual errors that are made in reports that are written by people who come from these kinds of backgrounds. We need both, and we need them to work together. The inverse could be we need to also strengthen quantitative knowledge and kind of methodological understanding in China studies. But we need to work together in some form or other, and we cannot do it just relying on these new fancy shiny tools that we see lying around. And lastly, we need to essentially break the chain of Chinese whispers. We need to make sure that we ourselves also go back to these original sources when we make policy. We need to really understand, what do these sources really say? We need to double check ourselves when we read reports that perhaps sound very appealing because they confirm what we believe, for good or for worse. And we need to essentially invest more effort in just going back to the original sources. This was, for me, the biggest thing that I had to learn when essentially graduating from China studies, where I just cite whatever I can see, to actually doing research at Merrick's and as my PhD. I almost never cite someone representing another source. I almost always go back to that source. And it's really shocking how often you find errors, or essentially you find that the source doesn't say what the authors say it does. So essentially double check ourselves. And I'll leave here. I look forward to the discussion.